Everybody, welcome.
This is a day. But I'm ready to go.
So we're going to start, and this should be a delightful and intimate event. My name is Alex Uhas, and I'm the chair of the film department. I'm going to serve as the moderator for this panel called Decolonizing the Imagination, Creatively Writing Sovereign States of Mind, part of the ongoing, fully formed, exciting Hess events featuring our Hess scholar, Jose David Saldivar. And what I'd like to do is begin with just quick biographies of our featured speakers, and then what's going to happen is they'll each present to you for 7 to 10 minutes. So just some brief thoughts about the topic at hand, and then I will work with the 3 speakers. There will be one more to have them have some conversation amongst themselves if they need me for that, and then we'll open the floor up to your thoughts and comments, and to a more real conversation, especially given that we're a small group. So that should be great fun. So, and do you guys care what order you speak in? You want to speak in the order in the program? Okay, so let's have Amina. Would you like to speak first? This is Amina Henry to my left. Would you like me to introduce you?
Sure.
Okay. Amina Henry is a Brooklyn-based playwright. She was a 2012-2013 Core Apprentice Playwright at the Playwright Center and a 2013 finalist for the Leah Ryan FEWW Playwriting Prize for her play Bully. She was a featured playwright at the 2013 Black and Latino Playwrights Conference at Texas State University. And why don't I just let you speak, and then hopefully Ken will be here, and we'll move forward down the line. So thanks for coming, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yes, I am a Brooklyn-based playwright, and I'm also a professor here at Brooklyn College. I graduated from the MFA playwriting program here, and I'm delighted to have been asked to be a part of this event because a lot of my work very much has to do with this question of decolonizing the mind. My personal history, I mean, I'm Jamaican American. Both of my parents were born in Jamaica, so I'm first generation American. And I really, when I was growing up, I was very much a reader, but I don't know that I read a lot of writers by people of color until I got into college, and particularly Jamaican writers or Caribbean writers even until I got to college. And I think a lot of my work these days has to do with thinking about what that did to me as an emerging writer in terms of the inspiration I received. So when I was growing up, I very much sort of loved the classics, if you will. I loved Shakespeare and the Brontes and Charles Dickens, sort of, to some degree. And it was kind of a revelation to me in college to even realize that there were Jamaican novelists that I could read. And I very consciously in college went about educating myself as it relates to Caribbean voices. And I realized that it was actually quite hard for me to even give myself permission as a writer to write about being Caribbean. And actually, I didn't know how to do that. And in fact, I'm not sure if I still know how to do that because I was so inoculated or so colonized, if you will, in terms of what I felt like was a valid story. So it's something that I'm still, in some ways, working through. I have a production of one of my plays happening in June at the Flea, and I'm telling you about it not to self-promote, but the play is actually about a writer who is Jamaican and is also a maid for an Upper East Side family. And much of the struggle in the play is her attempt to, it's called The Great Novel, and it's her attempt to write her own story and her inability to do so, because all she can really focus on is the lives of these people that she works for, and because she's very used to being, to some degree, a side note in the story. And the play is really exploring how she is able to, even a little bit, figure out ways to articulate her own experience. So that's interesting to me. I mean, I think when it comes to this question of decolonizing the mind, it's almost impossible. I mean, it's hard because you don't quite know where to begin. Like, you don't know what stories to be drawing from. And you also very much go through a period, I think, where all you're doing is kind of wrestling with this question of identity and thinking, okay, well, I need to write about Jamaicans, but actually I'm not, I'm Jamaican American, so what does that mean? I need to write about Americans, but I'm really Jamaican, so, and I'm a woman, so what does that mean? And who is my audience? And who am I actually in conversation with? Or questions that I grapple with. So those are questions that are very present in my work. They're questions that I'm very aware of as a professor. I'm very mindful of trying to assign work, even though at this point when you get to college, you hope at this day and age that students have been introduced to voices that are similar to their own before college, because at this point, it's just harder, I think, the older you get to figure out how to say things, to figure out how to articulate your experience if you haven't been taught how to do that, and you're not used to highlighting yourself, if you will, or highlighting the people around you. So it's sort of an ongoing process, if you will.
Thank you. And that's a great beginning, and I like many fruitful things I hope that we'll continue to talk about, but maybe we'll let it all kind of come together as one juicy set of ideas and then go from there. So Ken is not here, so Jose, I'll introduce you briefly, okay, and then you can speak. Jose David Saldivar is Leon Sloss Jr. Professor in Comparative Lit and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford University. He is a scholar of late post-contemporary culture, which is kind of cool, late post-contemporary culture. Yeah, especially the minoritized literatures of the United States, Latin America, and the Trans-American Hemisphere, and of border narrative and poetics from the 16th century to the present. And he is our 2019 Robert L. Hess Scholar in Residence at Brooklyn College this week. So thanks for being here, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Right. Thank you for having me. Tomorrow I'll be speaking about the U.S.-Mexico border, but I thought since I just finished a book that I would say just a word about it. And I've been working on a book on the Dominican-American writer Junot Diaz, and I can say just a little bit about the project and how I put together a symposium on Junot Diaz at Stanford, and the symposium was about Junot Diaz and the decolonial imagination. And so that anthology came out. You can read it. There's a lot of brilliant scholars that participated in it, including Junot Diaz, who was our keynote speaker. And he was going to read, his agent had contracted us that he was going to read a short story at the conference called Monstro, a science fiction story about zombies and Dominican Republic and Haiti. And it's an end-of-the-world apocalyptic narrative. And after I introduced Junot Diaz, he threw his manuscript on the podium, took off his microphone, stepped in front of the audience of maybe 1,000 people in the audience to hear Junot Diaz, mostly students, and he said, "Guess what, kids? No fucking lecture today." So I thought, oh my God, I was like sinking in my chair, like, why is Junot such a trickster? And then he proceeded to go without any lectures, notes whatsoever, and speak for 45 minutes about the decolonial imagination in his work, about zombies, and about race in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the 3 books and the movies. It was one of the most brilliant off-the-cuff lectures I've ever heard in my life. My colleagues who had been at Stanford a long time also agreed with me that it was one of the most brilliant performances of a young writer dealing with how he thinks about his work within this concept of decoloniality. So in my book, it's called Junot Diaz on the Half-Life of Love. I decided to kind of get away from the decolonial because in one of his short stories called The Cheater's Guide to Love, he writes a sentence that the half-life of love is forever. And so it struck me, what is it that Junot is trying to get across to us about love, about masculinity, about hypermasculinity, about what he writes about in his fiction. And so that's why the book is called On the Half-Life of Love. And I argue that his Dominican American fiction, starting with his MFA thesis at Cornell, Negocios, Drowned, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, This Is How You Lose Her, all grapple with how do you decolonize your imagination. If you've grown up in the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean, and been part of a Afro-Latino diaspora to New Jersey, what does that multiverse look like? And that's what I think he creates in his short stories and in Oscar Wilde. Almost all of his work is about New Jersey, where he grew up, Harlan, New Jersey, and so I became a big fan of Junot Diaz country when I visit New Jersey to get a sense of what he's writing about, and of course Santo Domingo and the Trujillato and the dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. So why does he arrest the attention of us as readers? What accompanies him in his fiction, of course, is his great style, but also the substance of his work. So in my book, I try to follow Diaz's lead from his own work at Cornell to his subsequent fiction to see how he gives us insights about the diaspora of Afro-Latinos from the Caribbean to the United States. So as I said, I try to follow the writer from his childhood through his college and graduate school experiences at Rutgers, through his time as an MFA student at Cornell, and I have a colleague at Stanford who just wrote a devastating book about MFA programs called The Program Era, where he basically says that writers are programmed in very specific ways at the major MFA programs in the country in this very programmatic way. I mean, and his name is Mark McGurl. He says, garbage in, garbage out. So it's a very very German Luhmann viewing of it. So I'm being a little bit tough on McGurl because I think much more happens at MFA programs. In my book, I grapple with Tolkien's influence on Diaz, Trujillo, Césaire, Fanon, Sandro Cisneros, the Anthropocene, mongooses. Why are mongooses? They appear in several of his work, and they usually appear as black feminine mongooses, which I think is interesting. His late night appearances on Seth Meyers, his relationship with Toni Morrison, who's in a conversation with Junot at the New York Public Library, has called Junot Diaz the most important young writer because he does something that many young writers, he says, no longer grapple with, that she finds something very human in his failed characters that are doomed. His male young characters, the women characters, are all doomed, Morrison says. I obviously also deal with his own recent essay, The Silence, in which he talks about his being raped as a young boy in New Jersey, and of course his recent own grappling in Broglio in the Me Too movement and how he kind of had to do that. The book was finished when that happened, and so I felt that I had to address those issues in the introduction of my book. And I'm trying my best to be as forthright as I can about the investigations of him at MIT. And off the record, I guess this is being recorded. Yes, it is being recorded. Well, off the record that I was also interviewed by the MIT administration and by but I wasn't by the Pulitzer Prize investigation. That both, what can you do? They said that from all their investigations, they found no other examples or situations of his being a virulent harasser in his work with students and colleagues. But my framework supports my work on Diaz with short stories. I also talk about his children's book, Island Born, as well. So I try to cover the whole ground. So the findings that I've written about do not add up to a tidy, neat narrative. Rather, I try to put some carne on the bones of my claims. I try to unpack his fictional cosmos, in which there is a continual dialogue among his characters, his settings, his mythologies, and strategies that continually appear and morph in his work. I mean, he's not the first writer to have an alter ego, Junior de las Casas, but these are the things that he's doing in his work. Why are Diaz's stories mainly stories of failure? So that's the big question I'm interested in. Why do his male characters' efforts to overcome their misogyny and the violence of coloniality of gender so central to his work? Like the Chileno writer Roberto Bolaño, stories and novels about the global abyss. He has a town that he writes about on the US-Mexico border called Santa Teresa at the end of The Savage Detectives and in 2666. I think Junot Diaz follows Bolaño's fictional world-making by focusing on how the loser always yields from a literary point of view far more than a winner. And this is what Bolaño was also focusing on in his work. So I'm interested in trying to answer why so many of his characters, both male and female, are doomed and tangled up in the failure of transcending the history of coloniality and transgenerational history of rape in the New World. So let me kind of stop there. Just that this is what the book tries to grapple with, and I try to make the case that he's grappling with two different things. One is history and misogyny and rape, and the other is why are his characters so doomed as a result of that history?
Thank you. So Ken, welcome, and I'm going to introduce you. I'm Alex, and what we're going to do after that, your co-panelists have spoken. I'll ask you some questions afterwards to continue the conversation, and we'll open the floor. So we can speak for maybe 5 or 7 or 10 minutes about the title of the panel, and I'll introduce you first. So to my left, and we're glad you're here, and take a breath, is Chen, who is a poet and an attorney who received his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and his JD from Yale Law School. His debut collection of poetry, Juvenalia 2010, won the Yale Series of Younger Poets Award. Chen's poetry and nonfiction essays have appeared in journals such as Fence, Boston Review, Best American Essays, and elsewhere. He lives and works in New York, where he directs the Asian American Writers Workshop and founded Culture Strike, a national organization seeking to bring artists into the migrant justice movement. So thank you for joining us. I want to hear what you have to say.
Thank you all for being here, and my apologies for being late. Google Maps told me it'd take like 30 minutes to get here, which is another reminder to never listen to Google Maps. So now I've learned my lesson. So I guess I can be here in two capacities, as an individual and as an embodiment of a 501c3 corporate entity called the Asian American Writers Workshop. So I'll talk about the workshop first, and then maybe I'll talk about some of my projects. So, you know, I'm guessing you're all writers in this room. How many of you are writers here? Probably everyone. So you should all, you know, come to events at the Asian American Writers Workshop and submit work. We were founded in 1991 as by like a bunch of young organizers, activists, novelists, poets, who would go to events in the Lower East Side in a kind of very different age of New York, where, you know, they'd sometimes go to the events and there would be like the only people of color there or the only Asian Americans there, and they started sharing their work at a Greek diner and kind of creating their own little community. And then since then, the workshop has professionalized a lot, and I've grown it a lot, so it's kind of more like a real organization. But a lot of well-known writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, who wrote The Namesake. She threw her first book party there when she was a young writer. Junot Diaz used to play Super Nintendo before he published his first book at the workshop. A lot of, in the present day, Ocean Vuong, when he was a teenager, would read his poems at our open mic. You know this TV show Fresh Off the Boat? It's based on a memoir by Eddie Huang, and he used to cater our events before his book came out. So there are a lot of writers who kind of secretly have a history with the workshop, and we're a very multiracial organization. So Asia is not just East Asian; it's also South Asia, West Asia, as well as transnational. We've also done a lot of events with a lot of other, writers of color like Tahimba Jess, Claudia Rankin, Roxanne Gay, and as you heard, we had this one project called Culture Strike, which was where we organized a boycott of Arizona, and we flew 50 writers and artists and activists to the U.S.-Arizona border, including people like Teju Cole and Daniel Alarcon, to kind of tour the border for a week and see a lot of the atrocities there. So we have a space on 27th Street, and we have an online magazine at aaww.org, and we have events every week. I think the election was like a wake-up call for us, because it actually made us realize how a lot of what we were doing already was very important, and that I feel like maybe a role we have on the landscape is as a kind of counterculture or a community that can be there to like inoculate against American like white nationalism. So like a lot of the stuff we do is about like immigrant writers, about helping undocumented writers, or having events featuring like Muslim or Arab writers. So I think part of it is to try to find like a kind of community gathering which is for immigrants or Muslim or people of color, where you don't have to define yourself in relationship to anything outside of your community, and from there you can kind of create a new sort of narrative that might be kind of like an antidote against some of the other narratives we've seen that might be like on Fox News or more prominent. So we have an online magazine, so you can submit work. We have an open mic that happens regularly, and we also have a lot of events in our space. So if you just go to aaww.org, you can see our events. And then, as an individual, I'm a writer, and I think the current project I'm working on is much more relevant to the topic than my first book. But I've been working on this project that is about my father passing away in 2012, and I started having these dreams where I would go to the underworld and I would see him there. And then it made me think about death as like a form of immigration. And I had a dream where he was in like an immigration prison, actually. And part of it is I was a lawyer where I had a client who was a girl who lived in Spanish Harlem, who was like undocumented Muslim teenager from West Africa. And she was in prison just because she went to this one mosque for like free food on like Friday nights. But I think maybe I took some of that imagery, and then the book sort of was initially about grief, but then what happened is, we do all these events that are about the history of colonialism, and I would read these books about like famines in India or something like that, and I would be like, oh wow, there's a lot of like brutal death energy and like trauma here. Like I really recognize this like feeling in like the blackness of grief. And so what I realized is that in this sort of like dreamscape that I was inventing, the book kind of became about like going to the underworld and then seeing in the underworld everything that had been killed by colonialism. So it's become this very weird book where I like meet like a lot of dead people from everywhere in the world, but like dead resistance leaders or dead people who've been assassinated, or slaves, or like indigenous lands even, or even like resources that had been extracted from other places. part of it's kind of become about the history of colonialism everywhere, but a lot of it is about the British Empire, because the British Empire created capitalism and it created the United States, and we're all here because of the British Empire. And it's also about the more recent history of the British Empire, which is that not a lot of people know. I mean, there's a very benign image of the British Empire, but in addition to, you know, slavery and, you know, dispossessing people in the New World, more recently they've like built concentration camps in like Kenya and Aden, in Malaysia. So the same year that my dad passed away, I discovered that there was this archive that was declassified. That was called the Migrated Archive, and it's a trove of like 1.3 million documents that the British destroyed in like hundreds of places where they colonized around the world, from like the Caribbean to Nigeria to the Falklands to India, you know, kind of everywhere that like it's like 200 countries. But they destroyed these documents because they were all documents that would be too embarrassing for other people to know about them. But because colonialism is all about like administration, bureaucracy, knowledge, they made like a copy set before they destroyed everything. And some of the documents had like a destruction certificate, you know? I don't know, I became very interested in this archive, and I visited it just for a few days and like sat there for hours like taking pictures of things. So part of that has influenced this book project, where there's like images from the archive in the project. But a lot of it is trying to think like the framework of the underworld was helpful emotionally, but it was also like an entry point creatively, because when you read about the past, it's so brutal, or there's so much fact to it that you feel like you don't have any kind of creative opening. So I think part of the challenge of the project is to both know as much as possible about what happened, but also to have some room for like a creative opening. So there's room for like something more imaginative or even like humorous. So I don't know, that's a lot of information in one go, but that's kind of an overview of some of the things I've heard.
So you can hear me, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what I thought I would do is ask you each a question that I think emerged from each other's presentations, and see if you wanted to open that out a little bit more or think from it. And the first would be from Amina's presentation about how late you came to a literature that was sustaining to you, and that represented your own history and Jamaican and Caribbean voices, and then you made a statement which was, you hope that our students now are not entering their college education from that place. So I'm wondering if the two of you would, or the other two of you would say, when did you come to a literature that sustained you? How old were you? And do you believe that we've made progress in that regard in relationship to younger people and in their educations in America? And think about that in relationship to a project that's the decolonizing of your own minds and the minds of your students.
I mean, I was born and raised on the U.S.-Mexico border in South Texas, but I had a really good public school, I guess, education that got me into Yale, because one of my high school teachers had gotten his PhD at the University of Indiana and had studied with Kurt Vonnegut. So he, our English class was fascinating because he taught all the American modernists. But the book that did kind of first clue me into something important was a book by Ralph Ellison called Invisible Man. And I read that when I was maybe 17, 16. It gave me a sense of what was possible in a novel, and the whole issue of invisibility. I mean, there's a line that I read that still stayed with me since my senior year in high school, when Ralph Ellison says that I am a walking personification of the negative. I mean, that sounded like extremely Marxist idea of negation and what it means to be a walking personification of the negative. So when I got to college, I knew I was going to be an English and a literature major, and I was a Latin American studies major. I wanted to pursue this idea. So I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and I really wanted to follow a tradition of thinking about the negative. And so, of course, I read my Feuerbach, I read my Marx, I read my Hegel, and that began to introduce me to some philosophical idea of what it means to be a personification of the negative. So at that point, I mean, if there was a decolonizing moment, it was when I was 17 years old.
Do you believe that young people today are finding the voices that sustain them,
Right.
and that open the world out to them? And
Right. I mean, since I'm also a professor of literature in English, I teach students. I've been teaching for the last 30 years. I also worked for Arte Biblico Press in my first job. I mean, when my students read Sandra Cisneros for the first time, when they read The House on Mango Street, what do they see themselves in this story that was written at the University of Iowa in the cornfields, but has nothing to do with the Iowa cornfields? It has to do with what it means to be growing up as a Latina in the rough urban world of Chicago. So I see that world opening up for my students. Or when I teach, I mean, I guess different students are seeing different things. When I teach Toni Morrison, you know, I don't teach Beloved. I have taught Beloved. It's one of the hardest books to teach, I think. But I teach a prequel to Beloved called A Mercy. And it's about the history of Toni Morrison country, that there's something bigger between the Ohio River, between Kentucky and Ohio, that's called the Virginia Colony. And I think that books is about the 16th century of colonization. And I see my students identifying with this history of what is it that this country was founded on? Well, it was founded on the whole issue of coloniality, of the Middle Passage, of racism. So my students are getting, you know, they're identifying with certain things. Of course, when I taught Junot Diaz recently, I taught his book Island Born, which is a children's book. All my students loved reading this book, but they were really concerned. Most of the women in the class were really concerned about the charges against Junot Diaz. So yes, I think they're being awakened by the fiction that's around them.
And did you want to? Well, it's her idea, but you could add to it.
So, I mean, I guess I could be more specific about that moment that I had. And I know for me, it wasn't that I didn't have black writers to deal with in high school. The issue is that I didn't really have Caribbean voices to deal with, which is very specific. And so I think very much in high school, because I'm Jamaican and it was not now, it wasn't, being black was not allowed to be specific. And so you had to just kind of be black. And so when I was in high school, there was a lot of, in some ways, play acting that I was doing because I really didn't know. I couldn't go back into my own family history and talk about certain things. I had to learn it along with everyone else in terms of like jazz even and the South and all these things, because that's just not, that wasn't my family's experience. I couldn't go back into my own family history and say this is, you know, this is what happened. And when I got to college, I went to Yale too. That's really funny. It's strange. Anyway, I was an English major, and so I thought it would sort of open my world up in terms of the kinds of books that I was being asked to read. And my first year, I was reading the Odyssey and the Iliad, so it really didn't help in terms of my understanding of literature. And then I discovered on my own Michelle Cliff, actually. That was sort of a moment for me, because I thought, oh, wow, this is set in Jamaica, and it's about this woman, and it's like so specific. And I also took a class called Introduction to Postcolonial Studies, and I was reading about concepts that felt very familiar to me that I hadn't been able to articulate up until that point. So that was really helpful to me. And I think I was always looking for texts that were not just text about people of color sort of reacting to white people, but actually writing about things that really had nothing to do with white people, that were just, okay, this isn't a reaction to this kind of monolithic, hegemonic situation. This is not about you. So I think I was hungry for that kind of thing, and Michelle Cliff began to teach me that actually those works do exist. You just have to really search for them.
I really like that answer, and I think part of it is that I think that you have this sense that like if you read like a writer who's the same like ethnicity to you, that you should automatically like assess if you can identify with them or not. And I think what's needed is not just writers of color, but a kind of like abundance and like variety. So there isn't just one person who represents, and there isn't just, you don't feel like you are like obligated to like something. And so I think coming to like discovering the Asian American Writers Workshop, I mean, it'd been around for like decades before I got there, but like I think what was interesting is that like when I got the job, actually I quit my previous job and one of my bosses said, "Are there Asian American writers?" And but if you think about it, I mean, the typical person, definitely like a few years ago, couldn't name that many Asian American writers, you know. And if you being in a space that's like premised about the cultural work of people of color, like you just can name like hundreds of them, and there's something liberating about that, not like in like real terms, and that there are a lot of people producing work, but it's also liberating because you're like, oh, I don't have to like everyone's work. Like I can just like the person's work that actually speaks to me. And I think now there is an improvement in that there are more writers of color. Like I know that, I mean, I feel like there's certain years at the workshop where there would be like, like I think one year there was like there's like maybe one novel by an Asian American person published who was like accessible to New York, like that whole year, like in like 2015 or something like that. But like now there are a lot more writers published, and there's a lot of more like media outlets for people to discover writers of color. And I think that that's really good, but the flip side is that I think that writers of color are asked to play like a certain role where you are here to produce difference that is then incorporated into the order that is there. So I think like maybe in another context or a different generation, like if you wrote about something that was very specific to your ethnicity, then that would be bad because it would be different. But now you writing about that is good because someone could be like pat themselves on the back for like valuing you because you're diverse, you know. And so I think that you are often put in a role where you have to perform and like turn yourself or your pain into like a commodity for an outside audience. So I think like having a context where you're not translating your story to someone outside of, from an outside place who would need translation is really important. And writing what you feel like you need to write, not like the story that you think you're supposed to tell because of what you look like or your gender or what you believe or things like that. So, and part of that also means just like, you know, reading is really important for writing, and it's reading both, you know, what, on the one hand, it's like also reading things that are very different from you, you know, like you could discover that like, you know, German philosophy is like really unlocks your way of dealing with your identity, you know, and it's that mode of difference that can help you. There's a line from Gramsci that Paul Gilroy would quote that's about like amassing the like infinite archive of the things that make up who you are, you know. So you're kind of in that task of finding these things that are very different. And then on the other hand, I think just there are all these people who are like on Instagram or something like that who are a young writer now, and they're much more famous than like someone who's like a neglected like, you know, Caribbean author from the 80s, or like, you know, there's a lot of talk about the canon, I think, in an academic context, but what's missing is actually kind of like community histories or like canon for like lineages of writers of color. So I think that there's a lot of discovery work that needs to be done around not the people who are like the cool up and coming young writers of color now, but the people who are writing in like even the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, who were not the super famous people, but like the other people who are there.
Okay, so this question's generated from Jose's comments, and I'd love to hear you all talk about doom. So Jose said it's an operating question for him in thinking about the book he's currently working on, and I'm wondering if doom is resonant for you in relationship to your own body of work, And is it a mood or a trajectory that seems useful for you to think about what you do? Or if not, would you give us another mood or trajectory that sits in conversation with doom, and particularly in relationship to this question of decolonizing the mind? Are we doomed? And what else is there besides doom? So any thoughts on that would be wonderful.
I don't think we're doomed. I think that's. I don't think that we're doomed. I think in general, writers or art makers tend to be the most optimistic people on a certain level, even though we're sort of dark and whatever. But you know, we keep making work in the hope that someone will read it or someone will experience it, and that we can change the world in some way. So I don't think that being an art maker is synonymous with a feeling of doom. I think I agree with what you said before. Like, I just think there needs to be a plethora of voices out there, so that each specific writer is not having to deal with the pressure and the weight of having to hold an entire community in their hands. You know, as a playwright, I struggle a lot with these issues of representation and what people's expectations are of me as a writer in terms of how I'm representing people of color, how I'm representing women, and you know, there is a bit of a party line, or not party line, it's sort of a race line where it's like, well, you don't want to show that in front of these white people. Like, you don't want to talk, we don't talk about that. We need to uplift the race, and I think the thing that you have to sort of work against is that feeling of like, well, what you're supposed to be doing is this, and really trusting what you're seeing, and you know, and presenting what you see. Well, okay, this is how I see the world. This is how I'm interpreting what I'm seeing. This is my particular truth, and I'm just going to add it to all of the truths that are out there already, and then let's see what happens. But it takes a certain level of courage to do that, because you do have not just white voices, but a lot of people sort of putting you in this sort of box, in this kind of prison, and you're constantly trying to be like, no, I just want to be free. I just want to do my thing. But it's harder than you would imagine, I think.
I feel like in the zeitgeist, in terms of talking about race, the whole vocabulary is all framed around pain and trauma, and so I think that that is like the discursive like lay of the land, and so I think that that's something that someone has to like reckon with, and I think personally, like my project, you know, it's hard to avoid this because like a lot of I just read these historical records where it's just kind of mind-blowing, where it's about like 100 million people like starved in like India, you know, because the British like engineered these famines, or like natives in, you know, Hispaniola or the New World, were like, oh, the world is ending because you came and like have ended the world, you know. But at the same time, like I feel like sometimes you can feel like pressure that like all you have is your doom, and I think a lot of people go into writing because, like, speaking personally, and I'm sure not for anyone else here, you had like, I think sometimes you go into writing because you have like a dysfunctional childhood, and or you know, you have something that alienates you from the rest of the world, but then you can have books and like a private self and like interiority, and then you can write, and that kind of makes up for it. And so writing is this generative act that's against doom, in that you're creating yourself and creating this, it's like an act of pure making against the damage that was done to you. And so I think you should never write in a sad or traumatized way out of a feeling of obligation. You should only do that if that's what you think you could say. You know, one thing I think about is like, you might want to think about like your favorite like TV shows or like music or something like that, and be like, you know, if I were to write that, like what would it be like, you know? And it might be that like as a writer you want to write something that sounds very serious, but you actually love like sitcoms or like pop music or something. Then like how can you make what you actually want to make? I don't know if that helps.
Do you want to follow
I'll just briefly say that I don't think that Junot Diaz feels that he's doomed, but his characters are doomed. That's I think that you have to make that distinction. Why are the characters so doomed? And I think that's coming out of a tradition of literature of the global South that begins with William Faulkner in Absalom, Absalom, that the doom of the South was slavery. I mean, that's a question that Toni Morrison then picks up when she writes her MFA thesis or her master's thesis at Cornell. In what way are we getting a representation of doom with a middle passage on U.S. slavery? And it's picked up again by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who reads Faulkner in translation. And the last line of Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, one of my favorite novels that I've written on, is that the people of Macondo are condenados, condemned. Now, I think there's an affiliation to being doomed and to having a whole family in Colombia experiencing a whole history of capitalism and colonialism, Garcia Marquez himself being a Cuban Marxist, that there's something about being condenado. And then I'm thinking of Frantz Fanon. What does it mean to be a damné, to be damned? And so, I mean, that is a certain kind of vision that certain writers that I'm attracted to are writing out. But I did want to make the distinction that I don't think Junot Diaz thinks that he's doomed, but that his characters are. And so what's the point of that, is what I'm trying to understand.
Thank you for that distinction. And we can wrap up with one question that I think connects to this and comes from Ken's comments, which is the other side of being damned or doomed is liberation and freedom.
Freedom, right.
And they're, they're conjoined.
Right.
It's one thing, the opposite side, and you can't have one without the other. So one would hope that Ken talks about antidotes against white violence, against that artists produce these antidotes. That's the word you use, an inoculation. Those are steps toward freedom and liberation. So can you talk about, I don't know, where that resonates in your work or in your world, these antidotes, these inoculations towards freedom, towards liberation, and if that's as sustaining to you as the flip side, the underworld. And, very literally, you're doing your work on the underworld as opposed to, what might be magnificent above. So, any thoughts on that?
Is that to all three of us?
Yeah, to all three of you, or not, and then we'll open the floor up as you'd like. If it's interesting to you.
I think one of the reasons why I'm drawn to theater, even though I love literature and read a lot of it, I think that there's a way in which theater, for me, can make things seem quite strange, that if you read it in a book or they don't seem strange. So I'm attracted to presenting the world in which we live in a way in which you can actually see this is very weird, which provides a space for people to have a conversation for how things could be versus how they are. I know that I never really questioned growing up reading certain books where it's like, oh yeah, of course, the slave or the domestic or what have you, and these, and I didn't really start questioning that until I became an adult. But I think it's much easier to ask questions sometimes when you're seeing it on stage and you're having to sort of experience a story that way, where it's like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are there slaves here? Or like, why are they acting this way? So I think for me, theater has provided a space for me to reach towards liberation just because of the format that theater provides.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Toy Derricott once said that joy is an act of revolution, and I feel like one thing I was trying to get at is that, like, I think just what you want to get to as a writer or a creator is this like thing of like pure making, and it's not even about like being a good writer or like having something to say, but just feeling like you can put words on a page or make like a gesture. And I feel like the more you get into this act of making, it's like almost like exercise, or like you know, something like that. It is just putting your energy out there. And I think that one thing that you do when you get more experience as a writer is that you get less, you lose that, the censor in your head, and it's more just about you having a more organic gesture of just kind of writing what you want to say. And I think that part of being in a school is like a kind of socialization where you're taught like what is good, what is bad, but then at the same time you're trying to get to a state where you can express yourself in a way that feels liberated, where you're not responding to what you think someone wants to hear. Other thoughts on joy and liberation. I mean, I think it is helpful to have a sense of like joy or liberation in what context, you know, and it might be about the context of like you finding a few friends in a program like this who understand you and can appreciate your work. And so when you're thinking of the reader, you are not thinking in this vacuum or imagining like someone who's the opposite of you and translating your work for them, but that you can imagine your audience in a way that's more kind to yourself. So you can imagine your friend, you know, reading it and you're not having to translate it to them. I mean, I think that's the value of groups like, you know, AAWW or Kave Kanam or Kantamunda or Kundiman or Vona or any number of groups, is trying to create community, so within that context you can feel more empowered. I also think that like there is this thing of like, you're talking about like, you know, writers historically being part of political movements like Third World Marxism. And one thing, like when I was growing up at the like tail end of like being Generation X, is like people just wrote like ironic things and no one believed in anything. And then 9/11 and Bush happened. And Bush is like much worse than Trump in many ways, in that, you know, millions of people have died in Iraq, you know, and so on and so on. But there was no like left in that time. But like in the rest of the world, there are like left mass movements, and you know, a lot of the writers, you know, that we admire, you know, were part of like communist movements or part of, you know, involved in Panthers or whatever. Even writers who've been really sanitized, like, you know, Maya Angelou had a huge like political life, you know, and you know, was involved in a lot of protests, you know, was friends with Malcolm X and so forth, which you wouldn't know from the way that she's been like repackaged. But I think that part of the thing in politics is joy, is a sense that you have like a horizon of possibility and that there is hope and there's a way out. But I think that for you as a writer, it's also tricky because part of the joy of being a writer is the sense of like weirdness and like creative openness, which is different than having a party line and knowing what the right answer is. So in life, joy might be like happiness, or it might be in politics, a sense that you really believe in like a horizon. But I think in writing, it's a little complicated because joy is more about like possibility. There's a book that just came out that's like interviews with like anarchist activists or something like this. Adrienne Marie Brown is in it, but there's part of it that's about joy is the affect of possibility. It's like the emotion of possibility. So I think what this might mean for you all as individual writers is like when you're writing things, like what are parts in your own writing that feel weird or that like you don't understand, and like that's often where like something interesting has happened that you can follow.
Yeah, that's why I'm so interested more as a thinker, critic, since I'm not an imaginative writer in that sense. But what is the role of the imagination? You know, the decolonial imagination. Why am I focused? Why are we focusing on the role of the imagination? And it's because the imagination gives us the power to think otherwise, to think possibilities of other possible worlds that we're in. And I'm thinking of the Zapatistas in Mexico, in Chiapas, whose one of their dictums is, "En cada mundo que quepan muchos mundos." In every world, there's many worlds. Is there a kind of indigenous notion of what I call reexistence, a philosophy of reexistence? So I think that what I try to convey to in my literature classes is the power of this imagination that we have. And yes, there's lots of, like Bolaño's generation. I mean, he grew up under the dictatorship of Pinochet, where the left had nothing to do but to lead his generation to the abyss, as Bolaño says. So on the one side we have the abyss, on the other side you have the people you love. He then moves to an exile to Mexico City in 1968, and he experiences the Pris massacre of students in Tenochtitlan. He then ends up in post-Franco Spain in exile. So I think for Bolaño and his generation, which is my generation, there was only the possibility of an abyss. But I think we have to use an imagination to get out of it. And I guess wanted to, I'll stop there. Maybe open it up to questions.
Yeah, I think this is the time to hear what you all are thinking, and we have 10, 15 minutes, so that's some time. You can ask a question or you can talk and join the conversation. Those are both permissible, and hope for those. Sir?
There is this paradox of power, which is at work in, when you mentioned that Junot Diaz, when his talent has been recognized, he has been talking about the dark side of hegemony and power, but when he gets into power, he harasses, some students or something. So when you look at the third world countries where you see that people who, got rid of the colonizer, started colonizing their own people, and there is concentration of wealth and power in all, ex-colonies. And I don't think writers from Pakistan, where I come from, can write as freely as they can in the U.S. So would you like to comment on this paradox that we see? Or has anybody written about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you're saying. I mean, I think that, first of all, if you, like, the paradox of colonialism is that colonialism, there is no such thing as post-colonialism. Like, there's still colonialism, and what usually happens is the colonial power leaves, and then the leftover place is still in thrall to the colonizer, or they just take over the military apparatus that was left behind, which is what happened in Pakistan. And obviously, if partition never happened, things might be different too. It's interesting, like a lot of the African Francophone anti-colonialists, they actually didn't want national liberation. They wanted to be part of a larger French empire, because they thought that if they were left behind, they would then just get left behind, and kind of what you said would happen. So that's like the more political response, or like historical response, which is maybe not what people are actually interested in. But I think the other thing is just about, I mean, beyond the question of history, how did things play out? Like Fanon and all these people are like, you have to beware the upper class of within the minority group, like the national bourgeoisie. But beyond all that, I think the question is sort of about what is the mode of power to have, and one thing that a lot of movements for more equitable ways of being, Italian autonomous movement people, or anarchists, they talk about having power with people rather than having power over. And so sometimes when you want to have power in the form of national liberation, you're essentially just trying to have power over other people. And a lot of national liberation movements, they were nationalists, just like Steve Bannon is a nationalist. They're right-wing movements. There's right and left-wing national liberation. But I think the goal is not necessarily national liberation. It's to have a dispersion of power itself. And in terms of writing, I think that takes place, that intersects in a few different ways beyond the more specific stuff that we're talking about. And I think part of what we need to consider as writers, what is the relationship you want to have with power? In the domain of successful writers of color, what often happens is that there is the writer of color comes from an elite background, or they're upper class, or there's one person who represents everything. I'm very inspired by projects that are may not necessarily produce a great writer who win a huge prize, but for example, there's this writer named Mark Nowak who has this thing called the Workers' Writers School, and he works with alternative worker centers like domestic workers or taxi drivers, and then they'll do a writing workshop together, and sometimes the poems will become incorporated into community theater or in terms of movements that these groups are doing. for like labor campaigns. And I think what's really inspiring about his project is that it is like intrinsically like a working class project, and he's not like the genius who's coming to lead them. It's like very driven by what the writers, like, you know, who might be like, you know, babysitters or like, you know, Pakistani taxi drivers. You know, many of them are like just working like crazy, but they're the ones who are like driving the project, and it's sort of their dreams that are the things that are being written down.
I'm not sure if this actually answers your question, but in terms of Junot Diaz, I mean, I'm thinking about people of color and their access to power, and I think historically, because we're so hungry and desperate for power, we're willing to sacrifice certain people within our race or ethnicity in order to have that power. So I think it's much easier to deal with issues around race and ethnicity for people than it is to deal with issues of gender and sexuality. And so often what you see is, okay, we're going to elevate this person, and we're going to sacrifice on a certain level these women who are also part of the story, but because we're so desperate to have someone who's speaking our truth somewhat, we don't know. I mean, I think some of it is a bit of a lack of imagination. Like, what about a world where, okay, he's really important, but also women are, you know, treated equally? I don't know if we're quite there yet.
Yes, please.
Kind of goes on the same topic of power and hegemony. You said something about theater being a space for people to have a conversation about what could be instead of what is. And I guess that's a question I have. You know, we are talking about writing, and one of the writers that I'm a historian, I'm not a writer, I'm not on that creative side necessarily. But Michel Rolfe-Trio is a Haitian-born writer and historian, and he has a book called Silencing the Past. And he talks about both the Haitian Revolution and the Treaty of Guadalupe, and how colonial powers used writing as a form of colonial power, and the fact that they were trying to, or conquering nations whose forms of culture and language don't revolve around written languages. So I guess, how do you imagine how do you have a decolonized imagination without a written word? I mean, as a writer. How do you, maybe I'm not putting this very well. What do you do for the colonized people whose languages have been taken away from them? How do they tell their story in a decolonized setting?
That's a good question.
Theater.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think if you want to talk about doom, I mean, I think the thing that I struggle with, or things that I've said to people, is that, gosh, I wish that I were a musician or a dancer, because, you know, when you're a writer, really, words are your weapon, words are your tool, and so you have to kind of figure out ways to keep kind of sharpening that tool, and in some ways, words can be like the most clumsy way of going about it. And when you're talking about representation, you're usually in the realm of language, and so even if you're talking about a community where, okay, well, we're not a part of this language system, you still have to deal with the fact that, okay, but then there are going to be other people who are putting you in a language system, and how do you, I don't know the answer to that question. It's like, how do you combat that, where other people are choosing to define you, and so how do you counteract that? I'm not sure, to be honest.
I haven't read that book, but I get the premise in that, you know, a lot of the ways we think about colonialism are about knowledge, and like, so the colonial power has like surveys or writing or maps, administration. You know, I mean, a lot of anthropologists and writers end up being part of this colonial project, but I don't think that there's a way to get out of colonialism. I don't think it's possible to have decolonization, and I don't think it's possible to have to feel like you're pure and you've escaped the system. So
said our last comment will be what you have to tell us.
I think for me, decolonization of the mind can happen one person at a time. Because my mother's from Trinidad, my father's from Brazil, I'm Canadian. And the first time I was called nigger, and my mom never read a book in her life. She sat me down and she told me, look at the bottom of your feet, what color are they? And I'm like, they're white. She's like, you don't have to worry about what anyone white says because you walk on white. And within you, there's everything that you need. And that was when I was in the 5th grade in 1975 or something like that. And from that moment, I didn't look at myself as, you know, black or whatever. I'm like, oh, I have everything I need. I'm all the power I need. And I think from that moment on, I was completely decolonized because whatever anyone says, whatever I read, and I didn't read anything about any part of myself until I was in my 40s. But I always felt connected to every book I read in some aspect, and I always felt powerful. Whatever room I stepped into, wherever I always felt like I was enough and I had everything in me. And I think that is a decolonizing moment. And if we can instill that one child or one person at a time without written word, right? Because my mother just talked to me and she doesn't write very well, and like I said, she never read a book in her life. So you don't need the written word, but you need someone who can empower you with whatever language they have.
I think that's how we should end. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. Thanks for organizing.